So I have a simple message, 5 words. Jesus Christ is our peace. You know, we live in a world that the acronym is just all too painful, a VUCA world. A world that's volatile, uncertain, complex, and angry. And you can just turn to any newspaper you like. Any day. Today it's Turkey. It's our country. It's another country. And I want to raise this question with you, which you will see as the title of this morning's message. Who will make the 2 halves whole? Who will make the 2 halves whole? In a divided world, who will make those halves whole? But you know, it's not just globally, it's individuals, our own lives. The internal disagreements, the misunderstandings, the divisions that we have. How do we pull them together? How can we see that unity that comes together in Jesus Christ? Do you know, I was thinking of the referendum that we've just had. I don't want to rehearse the arguments. I think we've all had enough of them. But on whatever side you were on, the problem was that we live in a post-fact world. When people think that one thing is a set of facts and they turn out to be a set of fiction. And when you take fact and fiction and put them together, you have faction, division, disagreement. You know, the people said that Brexit came and the referendum divided the nation. It did nothing of the sort. It merely highlighted divisions that were already there. The divisions that exist in our country, half our country wanted to stay within the European Union, half said they did not want to go. With our citizens, people in Scotland wanted to stay in the European Union and others said not. Our currency, people said that a strong sterling is a great thing to have. Others said that a weak sterling is a great thing to have. Our communities, rich, poor, young, old, differentials on race were there to divide us. A crisis in our own political leadership. And that's not bad enough. A week ago, 2.4 million words by the Chilcot inquiry to determine the issues around the Iraq war dividing the nation. Our church, this last week, the Archbishop of Canterbury was in the Synod of the Church of England, trying to work out how we could live together on the issues of same-sex marriage and human sexuality. Everywhere we look, change is in the air. Change is in the air. Now, what is the response that we're going to have to this change? Well, there are several ways of responding to it. You can either say, well, it's got something to do with some global event and leave it at that, or it's say, well, it starts with me. So you can either try and stop it and live in fear and fail, or you can try and slow it and live in frustration and fear, or you can try and shape it and flourish and be fulfilled. Which is it to be? I'm hugely excited by the choices that we face, because in this shaking, we are coming to understand our true identity. We will either shape or be shaped. So how do we change the narrative of our time? How do we manage to move from borders to bridges, from damaged halves to determined hope, from factions to friends, from fear to faith? I'll give you an answer. By investing outside of the status quo. We have a generation that is longing to hear something new, some fresh hope, some new vision, some new pattern of behavior, tired of the old ways of doing things, the same old, same old. They want to hear something where someone has invested outside of that status quo, outside of what is the normal patterns. But before we can do that, we need to know how to deal with disagreement, misunderstanding, and internal divisions. Jesus Christ is our peace. I had the great privilege of serving as a trustee of the Nelson Mandela Children's Fund for many years, and as a result met him on a few occasions. And once we were talking, and you know what it's like when you meet somebody that's really famous and you say to yourself, oh my goodness, what am I going to say? What am I going to ask? I want to say something really profound. So I stumbled some words, and they were, Madiba, which is his Costa name. Tell me, what advice would you give me? And he said to me, so memorably, I can see the situation where he was sitting, and I was there. I've got a photograph of it in my study. He said to me, Ken, it is very easy to make for disagreement. It is very difficult to make for peace. Ken, you must make for peace. Riveting. Simple. And that is true. In the midst of this change, flowers of the field flourish and die, says Isaiah, but the word of the Lord lasts forever. So I want to look at the Bible's message to us on how to deal with disagreement. And I want you to look at Joshua chapter 22. If you have a Bible or a smart near you, otherwise you'll find it coming up on the screen. Now, the whole of the book of Joshua is a story about how a ragtag group of nomadic people who were wandering around for 500 years and then 400 in slavery in Egypt came together in the land that God had given to them to conquer the land of Canaan and then to divide it up amongst the various tribes. And then we get to chapter 22, and it is as if Joshua is saying, I want to deal with something before you go, which is, what do you do when you have a disagreement? And so here is the story. So what happened, and let me just show you a map of Israel at the time of Joshua. Do you see that Israel at the time of Joshua was divided by the Jordan River, which you see going straight up, a straight border in between those on the left, with Jerusalem on the eastern side, on the western side in Judah, and then on the right-hand side, the eastern side, Reuben, Gad, and the half tribe of Manasseh. And those tribes on the eastern side came over to fight with Judah against the Canaanites during 7 years of war. They brought 40,000 people to be with them. And the land that they had was massively wealthy. And they come to the end, and they say to Joshua, we want to go to our homes. We want to go back. We want to till our farms and our land. And Joshua says to them, that is absolutely fine. But Joshua knows that where there is wealth and prosperity, there is danger. And he gives them a message which is very true for you and for me today. In Joshua 22, chapter 5, verse 5, he says this. He says, look, you can go back, but remember these 5 things. Love the Lord your God. Walk in all his ways. Keep his commandments. Hold fast to him. Bind yourself to him. Cleave to him. Serve him with your heart and with your soul. And with that ringing in their ears, those 5 things of clinging to God, they move on from Shiloh across to the land where they'd left their families on the east side of the Jordan River. But just before they get there, they say to themselves in a fit of FOMO, oh, the fear of missing out. What would happen if we missed all that was going on where the Ark of the Covenant, where the people of God were meeting? And they said, I'll tell you what we'll do. We will build an altar. So they build an altar right on the Israelite side of the Jordan River on the west bank. A huge, massive altar. Well, Moses had specifically given them instructions. You cannot build another place for worshiping God except where the Ark of the Covenant was and an altar straight outside of it. And here they were building something in direct challenge to the sovereignty of the presence of God. And what happened was predictable. Verse 12, the whole assembly of Israel gathered at Shiloh to go to war against them. They said, what do you think you're doing? On the face of it, this was an extraordinary thing to have done. However, there was a massive misunderstanding. Because what those tribes were doing is, on the face of it, building something that was an attack on their previous comrades. I mean, do you know, it is very true. I don't know if you feel that sometimes when you have a massive disagreement or a misunderstanding with someone, that what happens is it feels as if somebody's on your lawn. Tanks are on your lawn, in your space, in the world that is yours. And you feel deeply offended that this is what has happened. Do you ever sense that? Sure. And this is what they felt. And so the high priest Phinehas didn't even ask Joshua. Phinehas and the heads of the 10 tribes of Israel, amazing combination of the priests and the people, come together, that group, and they go over to find out what on earth has gone on. And of course, what had happened there was that, it wasn't a rebellion. What they wanted was a place of remembrance. It wasn't that they were wanting to build a border and have a border dispute on the Jordan River. It was that they wanted to be able to build a bridge between their side of the Jordan and the other side. It wasn't the separation of sovereignty. They weren't trying to create a new alternative place of worship. Not the separation of sovereignty, but a spiritual solidarity. It was a massive misunderstanding, absolutely catastrophic. War had been declared. They just finished beating the Canaanites. Now they were starting a war against their own people. Now, what do we learn from this? The first thing we learn is you need the courage to confront. It requires courage to confront major issues of division and disagreement. And that is true whether you're a citizen, a community, a church, a city, or a country. It works for every single one of us. So the first thing they learn is this, is don't speculate, investigate. Don't speculate about what they're thinking. Go and investigate what the issue is. So Phinehas leads this group of people to go and find out what it is, to find out what the facts are, establish the facts before we get this whole sort of factional anger that is growing. The second is that conciliation comes before conflict. Before the conflict starts, they go to the very place of the misunderstanding. They're not lobbing a brick at the oppo. They're not sort of sending out an angered tweet or a retweet filled with anxious anxieties. Yes, there is bold language. Listen to this, because of course the confrontation, this is serious because people are threatening the very integrity of the people of God. Listen to this in verse 16. Manasseh and the group says to them, We're not speaking on our own. The whole assembly of the Lord. This is not some group of people, but it's God's people. The whole assembly of the Lord says, how could you break faith with the God of Israel like this? How could you turn away from the Lord and build yourself an altar in rebellion against him now? Was not the sin of Peor enough for us? Up to this very day, we have not cleansed ourselves from that sin, even though a plague fell on the community of the Lord. And are you now turning away from the Lord? If you rebel against the Lord today, tomorrow he will be angry with the whole community of Israel. Do you see that? What he's saying is boldly and clearly that sin is serious. Consequences of sin are catastrophic. He says to them that in verse 17, there's no such thing as a private sin. Sin that separates us from God, that acts against the commandments of God, will affect the whole community. All of us are going to be affected if you try and set up some separate worshiping place. I was very interested. I am interested in this topic of sin, mostly, I suppose, because trying to confess my own. But I had gathered a group of people in my home, some young people in their early 20s, to discuss the question as to whether sin has any relevance, or what does it mean to a modern generation? Are the 10 commandments enough? Should we add a few more, maybe 12? And we had a fascinating discussion. Let me assure you, we didn't think we needed to add any further commandments. But one of the things that was really interesting was this. The young guys felt that belonging was the most important desire of this generation, to belong. And therefore, if you're cleaving to God, belonging to him, to do something that would breach that sense of belonging was unforgivable. And that was a sin. And that's what they wanted to do. I was very interested in that. Sin separates, but it affects a community. And there's no such thing as private sin. And that's what they were anxious about. And then they go on to say to them, they need to contribute to the compromise. You know, when you're in a disagreement, a misunderstanding, you have to come to some form of compromise. Otherwise, it's just head-banging. You know what it's like, the jealousies and the backstabbing at the workplace. It's just head-banging. So there's some form of compromise is necessary. And I absolutely love this bit in which they say to themselves, in verse 19, we're going to be prepared to share the pain of this, of what has gone wrong. Listen to this. If the land you possess is defiled, come over to the Lord's land, where the Lord's tabernacle stands, and share the land with us. They were quite prepared to sacrifice their own interests. They were quite prepared to say, come over to us, we'll share what we've got. But don't separate yourselves from God. Don't separate yourselves from the people of God. That is extraordinary, isn't it? And it's true of every compromise, of every misunderstanding, some or another, we give up and swallow up our pride and are prepared to work together. And then they considered the concerns of the others before reacting. So the people of Reuben and Gad, they see these guys coming up, and the guys just go for them, as I've read to you, and they look at it and they say, oh my goodness, this is a massive misunderstanding. Massive. And listen to them, hear what they say, their first words, which is extraordinary. The first words, verse 22, the mighty one, God, the Lord, the mighty one, God, the Lord, 5 times calling on God. You know, the first things, their first reactions is not, oh my goodness, you've misunderstood. Now let me explain to you what has gone on. We were wanting to build a place of remembrance. We did not want to build a place of rebellion. Now you must understand that these are the facts. It's perfectly obvious. You could have seen what was happening. None of that. First thing is, God, we have messed up. God, the Lord, he knows. And let Israel know, if this has been a rebellion or disobedience to the Lord, don't spare us today. They come, sort of swallow their pride. They get themselves focused. They get themselves the perspective that they need. And only then do they say, well, I just want you to understand this is a misunderstanding. We wanted, he says in verse 24, we wanted to make sure that our children would remember that once upon a time we were part of this great people of God on the western side of the border. And then it's all resolved. And the wonderful thing is the high priest in verse 30 says, he heard them and he said that they were pleased. The high priest was pleased. There was a high five at the time. They were pleased. They celebrated the conclusion. They celebrated the conclusion because they said, today we know that the Lord is with us because you have not been unfaithful to the Lord in this matter. The Lord has been with us. Do you see? They come back to God every time. And then they report back and they say, we were glad. They were glad, the whole assembly of Israel, glad to hear the report. When you celebrate the conclusion, you need to celebrate it in some form. A high five, a hug, a letter, a tweet, or a retweet. What they meant as a bridge, or as a barrier, became a bridge. And so Phinehas was so pleased. See, we must remember one thing. Conclusions are not to be jumped at, but to be judged by the Spirit of God. They were confronted, confusion, conciliation, and then a celebration. And ultimately, there was the concern for the commandments. The concern for the commandments, that God was a party to this. So let me just say to you this. You may think that the Brexit vote, the referendum, was the most obvious, difficult, divisive, whatever word you want to do, separation of two halves that we can remember recently. It isn't. Within the last month, it has been shown by the Office of Statistics that the faith in Jesus Christ that we have had as a nation for over 1,000 years is now confessed by less than half the population. And over half the population regard themselves as having no religious conviction. They're the nuns. That is not just a statistic. That is a profound challenge to you and to me, because the gospel of Jesus Christ is good news for everyone, not just for Christians. It is good news, as I've said before, for the citizens, for the cities, for the communities, for the churches, and for the country, not just for some pious group of people. Jesus Christ is our hope. He is our peace. He has brought together all that we could possibly want in his body. Let me read to you St. Paul's letter to the Ephesians, an extraordinary place in which what Paul is trying to say to the Ephesians, you know, there was a time when there was a total division between those who could have access to God and those who couldn't. But he has drawn them together. Verse 14, for he himself, Jesus Christ, is our peace, who has made the two groups one and has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility, by setting aside in his flesh the law with all its commandments and regulations. His purpose was to create in himself one new humanity out of the two, thus making peace, and in one body to reconcile both of them to God through the cross, by which he put to death their hostility. He came and he preached peace to you who were far away, and peace to you who were near. For through him we both have access to the Father by one Spirit. Do you know, Jesus didn't come to establish some new religious movement, some new government. He came to establish a new humanity, a new fullness of our human beings, the flourishing of a human person, to be able to flourish in workplaces that are harsh, in times of stress and in pressure. On the cross, he died to make whole the halves. And when he died, the veil in the temple was split in two halves. And in his body, he brought them together. Now, what was those halves? The halves were that there was a veil in the temple, which was the Holy of Holies, where only the high priest could enter, and that only once a year. And the rest were the great unwashed, the sort of people that were there, that couldn't have access to the presence of God. And when he split that veil, he broke all that history that said there is a division, made it whole. Never again in the history of mankind will the presence of God be only in one place. By his Spirit, when he died on the cross, he made us one. He brought humanity and God into a relationship that can never be broken. And the Spirit of God, the presence of God, is now invading the whole of the world around us. That is the power of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. That is the power of his Spirit to make us one humanity. He won the battle that separated us from God. Those who knew God, he assured them of their future. Those who did not know God, he assured them that the halves were made whole. On the cross, he brought them together. Do you know, a border can be a bridge. The cross is the very border that you would see with humanity. That's where he died. That's the end. It's finished. But that very cross became the bridge. I was just thinking obviously of Nelson Mandela. You know, a prison is a place where you're locked up and there's a big wall. And yet that dividing wall could not stop the prisoners on Robben Island singing to give them hope. I think of Richard Wurmbrand, the Romanian pastor. 3 years solitary confinement underground, tapping out through a wall which on the face of it was the place of division, actually turned out to be the place of hope. The very dividing wall. You think, as Simone Weil has told us, of those people in concentration camps, weakly tapping out, nothing much but tapping to show that they were alive. Borders can be bridges. You don't have to just live within some small dwelling place where there is no hope. Separation is the default setting of humans. Making whole is always and always will be the real-time saving of Jesus Christ. Reconciliation is not an aspect of the good news of Jesus Christ. Reconciliation is the good news of Jesus Christ. Real time, now, available to us in the power of the Spirit of God. Let me ask you, where is your border dispute? Where is it with you or your family or your friends or the people at work? Where is it that there is misunderstanding or division or disagreement? Let us bring it to the cross of Christ. You know, we need the church not just as a place of healing. The church doesn't just heal, and yes, it does that. But the church is also there to show to a nation a purpose. If you want a phrase in the title of this new book, to know your why. Not just individually, but as our churches, as our communities. To know what our identity is in Jesus Christ, because that is the power of God. Yes, we look around and we see that there is death around us. But actually, when we come to think about it, there is life, because Jesus Christ is our life. The challenge for us is, how will we see life grow for the nuns? For those who do not understand, that Jesus Christ means hope. That's the challenge. And the challenge that the Reubenites issue for us at the moment, the challenge that they have is this. When our children, as they said, when those descendants turn, what will they say? Will they say, well, what was this Jesus Christ that you talked about? What is this place that you were there to share? In verse 24, what do you have to do with the Lord, the God of Israel? What is this? You have no share in the Lord. That's what they were frightened of, that these two halves would not share in the Lord. The challenge for us is, do we want to be the last generation that says there are two halves in this country and that's just the way it is? Or are we going to say that no, we believe in the power of God to bring reconciliation, to bring change? How do we change the narrative of our time from borders to bridges, from damaged halves to determined hope, from factions to friends, from fear to hope? Well, we do it because we have the power of the Spirit of the living God working within us. He is our peace. He is the one that makes the halves whole. Let us stand and worship this God.
I'm Bear Grylls. My favourite way to start the day, the Bible in 1 year. That's how wild I am.
Find out more at BibleIn1year.org or download the Bible in 1 Year app.